They said distance would help. 1,000 miles. That was the number everyone kept repeating like it was a spell. Like it could be spoken enough times to become true. 1,000 miles from the lake. 1,000 miles from the cabins. 1,000 miles from the sound of wet leaves under boots that weren't mine. I repeated it too at first. In therapy sessions, in the mirror, in texts to people who didn't know what to say anymore. 1,000 miles away. Safe now. But distance doesn't erase habits, and it doesn't erase senses. I chose this place because it was cheap, because it was quiet, because it wasn't near anything anyone would call a destination. A rental house at the edge of a town that barely even qualified as one. 2 bedrooms, a small porch, trees thick enough behind it that the wind carried a smell I told myself was just pine and soil. Sometimes it wasn't. I noticed the little things first. I always do. I always did. The front door, for instance. I bolt it every night. I check it every night. Once wasn't enough anymore after that summer. I pulled it closed, slide the bolt, test the handle. Then I do it again before bed. Sometimes again when I wake up sweating at 2 a.m, convinced that I've heard breathing where no one should be. Twice now I've come down in the morning to find it unlocked. Not wide open, not swinging, just not bolted. The rational explanations line up easily enough. Muscle memory failing, dissociation, PTSD, as everyone says, delivered gently and confidently as if naming it solves it. I nod and I agree. I want to believe them because believing them is easier than imagining the alternatives. Still, I started marking things. A piece of tape folded into a tiny triangle and placed at the top of the door frame. Invisible unless you know to look. If the door opens, the tape falls. It fell yesterday. I didn't tell anyone that part. The smell comes and goes. It's faint enough that I question myself every time. That's the worst part. If it were strong, I could name it, react to it, do something. But it's never quite enough to justify panic. It drifts in like a memory I didn't ask for. Woodsy and damp. Underneath it, metallic. Old pennies, rust. Something that doesn't belong in a place where nothing has been hurt. My therapist says scent is powerful, that the brain stores it differently, closer to emotion than logic. She says trauma can resurrect smells long after the source is gone. She asks me to describe it, and I do, carefully leaving out the part where it makes my hands shake. Grounding techniques, she suggests. So when the smell comes, I ground myself. I name objects. Table, couch, lamp, window. I tell myself where I am. I open the windows wider, even when it's cold out, even when the trees whisper against each other like they're sharing something. The smell never gets stronger. It never fades completely either. Last night, it followed me into my bedroom. I checked the closet twice, then 3 times. Nothing inside but clothes and boxes I still haven't unpacked. I shut the door, leaned my weight against it, and stood there listening to my own breathing until it slowed. When I turned around, the window was open wider than I remembered leaving it. I've been trying to be normal. That's the word people like to use, normal. As if it's something you can return to, like a misplaced item. I go to work. I smile when appropriate. I accept invitations even when every instinct tells me to stay home and listen for footsteps that aren't there. That's how I met Mark. Through work. He's the kind of person who fills silence without realizing it, who jokes when tension creeps in, who thinks laughter is a universal solvent. He knows what happened, in broad strokes. Everyone does. Final girl survivor stories travel fast, even when no one uses that phrase out loud. When I told him I was still unpacking weeks after moving in, he offered to help. Distraction, he said. Doctor approved. I didn't correct him. He came over that afternoon with coffee and an energy that felt too loud for my small living room. The house seemed to shrink around him like it didn't know what to do with a voice that confident. We worked through boxes together, kitchen stuff first, then books. He kept handing me items and asking questions about them, about me, about that summer. I deflected when I could. When I couldn't, he softened his voice and nodded in the right places. You're safe now, he said at one point, like he was reminding himself, too. I smiled. I even believed it for a moment. Then he went out to his car and came back with a thrift store bag swinging from his hand. Look what I found, Mark said. He was grinning. The kind of grin people get when they think they're about to be clever. He reached into the bag and pulled it out, holding it up like a trophy. The mask. Time did something strange to it in my hands, but not enough. The shape was the same. The cheap plastic warped slightly along the jaw, the surface scuffed and dulled. One strap was missing, the other stretched thin. I didn't move. I thought it'd be funny, he went on, already misreading my silence. You know, for a horror movie night. Thrift store gold, right? He laughed. The sound scraped against my nerves. I felt my heart beat in my throat. The room tilted just enough to make me grip the counter behind me. My vision tunneled, locking onto the eye holes. Too dark, too deep. Like they led somewhere else. That's not funny, I said finally. And my voice sounded distant, like it had to travel a long way to reach my mouth. Mark blinked. Hey, sorry, I didn't. He stopped talking because he was already lifting it. Just messing around, he said. And before I could tell him not to, before I could explain that this wasn't a mask, this was the mask, he pulled it over his face. The smile disappeared behind plastic. The room went quiet. For half a second, just half, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was back there, summer heat pressing down, trees too close, the sound of someone breathing where no one should be, right behind me. Mark tilted his head, mimicking something he'd seen in a movie. And that was when I screamed. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. He tore the mask off immediately, color draining from his face. I'm so sorry, he said over and over. I didn't think, I swear I didn't think. I nodded and I told him it was okay. It wasn't. He left soon after, apologizing again at the door. I watched him drive away through the window until his car disappeared down the road. The mask was still on my table. I hadn't seen him set it down. There are things that I know for certain. I know I did not bring that mask into this house. I know I did not ask Mark to leave it. I know that when I picked it up, it felt warmer than it should have. I told myself it was residual heat from his hands. I told myself not to read anything into it. Then I washed my hands anyway, scrubbing until my skin burned. I put the mask back into the thrift store bag and tied it shut. I meant to throw it away, I really did. But when I opened the front door, the smell hit me again, stronger this time, copper threading through damp leaves. The trees behind the house were moving even though there was no wind. I shut the door and locked it, bolted it, checked the tape. The bag went into the hall closet, top shelf, buried behind coats. I sat on the couch and just breathed until my vision cleared. That night, I dreamt of unpacking boxes that never emptied, each one full of the same thing. Plastic, scratches, hollow eyes. When I woke up, the closet door was open. The bag was gone. I didn't call the police. I considered it. I even picked up my phone and opened the keypad. But what would I say? Someone took a mask from my closet? Someone who left no sign of entry, no disturbance beyond the absence itself? They'd say it was just stress, trauma, sleepwalking even. And they'd be right. That's the worst part. They could be right, and it wouldn't mean I was wrong. I searched my house instead. Every room, every drawer, under the beds, behind the washer. I checked the attic ladder even though I hadn't unpacked it yet. Even though the thought of climbing up there made my stomach twist. Nothing. But the smell was back, clinging to the hallway like it had weight. I stood very still and listened. At first, there was nothing but the house settling. Pipes trickling, wood complaining softly. Then, faint, almost imagined, the sound of something shifting where it shouldn't. Not footsteps, fabric. I locked myself in the bedroom that night and dragged the dresser in front of the door. I slept in short bursts, waking at every creak, every whisper of movement outside. At 3:17 a.m., I heard breathing. Slow, controlled, and patient. I did not open the door. Mark texted the next morning. Hey, I've been thinking about yesterday, and I feel awful. I didn't reply. Another message came an hour later. I swear I didn't leave that mask there to mess with you. My hands went cold. What do you mean? I typed, then erased it. Typed again. You didn't leave it? The response came almost immediately. No, I brought it as a joke, yeah, but when I saw how upset you were, I put it back in the bag and took it with me. I remember because I didn't want it in your house. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I saw it on the table after you left, I typed. There was a pause this time. That's not possible. The smell drifted through the room again, thick enough now that my eyes watered. Mark, I wrote, are you sure you didn't forget it? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. I'm sure, he said, because when I got home, the bag was empty. I shouldn't have gone outside. I knew that. Every survival instinct screamed it. But knowing something and obeying it are two different skills, and I've never been good at the second one. The smell led me to the back of the property, to the line where the mowed grass gave up and the forest began. The air was cooler there, heavier. Sound behaved differently under the trees, swallowed and redirected until distance meant nothing. I stood at the edge and called Mark's name once, just to hear a human voice in the space. Something answered, but not with words. Not exactly. Just a shift, deeper in, like something acknowledging it had been noticed. I didn't step forward. That's when I saw it. The bag laying at the base of a tree, half open. The mask visible inside. The strap hung loose, brushing against leaves like a finger trailing along skin. I took a step back. I heard the leaves behind me crunch. I ran. I stayed. That part surprises people when they hear about it later, if they hear it at all. They expect flight, another move, another 1,000 miles. But running only teaches things how fast you are, and I was tired of giving lessons. The police finished their work quickly. They always do when there's nothing they can catalog. They walked the tree line, took photos of disturbed leaves, and asked me to describe the mask again. One of them tried to make a joke about horror movies and stopped halfway through when he saw my face. They returned the bag, empty. I watched them place it gently on the kitchen table like it might bruise if handled too roughly. When they left, the house felt larger, stretched thin around the absence of voices. I locked the door after them, bolted it, checked the tape. It held. For 3 days, nothing happened. No smell, no sounds at night, no dreams of water and rising shapes. I slept longer than I had in months, the kind of deep, blank sleep people talk about with reverence. On the 4th night, the wind came back. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to stir the trees behind the house, to remind me they were still there. The smell followed shortly after, faint but unmistakable, drifting through rooms I hadn't entered yet that evening. I didn't panic. That surprised me too. I stood in the hallway and waited, listening, letting my body decide what to do before my thoughts caught up. Somewhere in the house, something shifted. Not footsteps or breath. Plastic. Settling. I found the mask on the porch the next morning. It was placed carefully on the small table beside the door, facing inward as if it had been brought home and left where it could be found without effort. The surface was cleaner than I remembered. The straps lay neatly coiled beside it. I stood there for a long time, keys in my hand, considering my options. Throwing it away hadn't worked. Burying it only changed where it surfaced. Burning it, I suspected, would teach it something I didn't want it to learn. So I picked it up. It was cool this time. Neutral. As ordinary as it was ever going to be. I carried it inside and set it on the shelf in the hallway, the one that had been empty because I hadn't known what to put there. The mask fit perfectly, like the space had been waiting for it. The smell receded. That night, the door stayed locked. Not because I checked it more often or because I added new markers or routines. It stayed locked because it wanted to be seen, not invited. I understand that now. The mask doesn't hunt. It doesn't stalk. It doesn't even kill, not directly. It arrives. It waits. It lets people choose how close they want to stand to it, how long they want to pretend it's harmless. It remembers the shapes of things. Camps, houses, victims, survivors, me. Mark doesn't visit anymore. He still texts sometimes, careful and distant, like someone speaking to a place they once lived. I don't correct his assumptions. I let him believe what he needs to. My therapist says stability is about control, about reclaiming space. She wouldn't like my solution. The house is quiet most nights now. The wind moves through the trees, carrying familiar smells, familiar patience. The mask stays where I put it. I don't hide it. I don't explain it. When someone new comes over, a repairman, a neighbor, someone, anyone, who laughs too easily, their eyes always drift to the shelf, and then hesitantly to me. They always pause before they ask. I tell them it's something I kept. I don't tell them why. Some stories don't end. They just get unpacked carefully, piece by piece, until everything has a place and nothing feels out of order anymore. The door is bolted tonight. The tape is still there. And the house knows who, no, what answers my door now. I stared at the mirror, my face twisted in disbelief. The skin that stared back wasn't mine. It was youthful, delicate, the face of a woman. And yet somewhere beneath those bright eyes and full lips, I knew it was still me. How could I explain what happened? How could I even begin to make sense of it myself? Let me start at the beginning. I'm an old man, 65 years of life, most of it unremarkable. I had a wife once, but she passed away years ago. No children, no family left to speak of, and the friends I once had have long since drifted or passed away. These days, it's just me and my house, an old Victorian relic perched on the outskirts of town, filled with more memories than I care to relive. I've always been a solitary man. Maybe that's why, when the antique shop appeared in town, tucked away in a narrow alley I don't remember ever seeing before, I was drawn to it. The sign above the door read Curiosities and Relics in faded gold lettering, and I felt an odd pull, like it was calling me in. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something wasn't right. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and age. Shelves crowded with strange objects filled every corner. Porcelain dolls, rusted locks, faded paintings. In the center of it all, behind the counter, sat an old woman. Her eyes were impossibly sharp despite her age, and they followed me with an unsettling intensity as I wandered through the shop. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. A mirror, oval-shaped, framed in tarnished silver. It hung from the back wall, half hidden behind stacks of odd trinkets. There was something about it, something familiar, as if I'd seen it before in a dream. "Ah, that one," the old woman said, her voice low and gravelly like she hadn't spoken in years. "That mirror's not for everyone, you know." I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She smiled, revealing a mouthful of yellowed teeth. "It shows you things about yourself. Some people don't like what they see." I snorted. "I've lived a long life. I've seen all I care to see." Her smile widened. "Oh, have you now? Be careful what you wish for, old man. Sometimes the past isn't as far away as you think." I bought the mirror, ignoring the way her eyes seemed to bore into my soul as I handed over the money. I told myself it was just an impulse purchase, a whimsical desire to fill the empty corners of my house. But deep down I knew there was something more to it. I didn't hang it immediately. I placed it in my study, propped it up against the wall, and tried to forget about it. But over the next few days, I felt it drawing me in. Every time I walked past the door to my study, I caught myself glancing at it, half expecting, I don't know, something. One night, after a glass too many of good scotch, I found myself standing in front of it, staring at my reflection. My face was tired, lines etched deep into my skin, my hair thin and gray. I looked old, older than I felt. I ran a hand through my beard, sighed, and turned away. That's when it happened. There was a ripple, like a stone thrown into a pond. I turned back to the mirror, my heart hammering in my chest. My reflection, it wasn't mine anymore. The face staring back at me was young, beautiful even. A woman in her 20s with soft, unlined skin and dark flowing hair. Her eyes were wide, filled with confusion and terror. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I had to be drunk or hallucinating. But when I raised my hand to touch my face, the smooth, soft skin I felt wasn't mine. It was hers. Panic surged through me. I spun away from the mirror, rushing to the nearest surface that reflected, an old dusty window, and there she was again, staring back at me. No matter where I looked, she was there. This young woman. Me. Days passed, and I tried everything I could to break this curse. Because it was a curse. What else could it be? I smashed the mirror, but the change remained. I tore through my house, destroying anything reflective, but every surface, even the gleam of a polished doorknob, showed her face. The worst part, it wasn't just my reflection. My body had changed too. My joints no longer ached, my vision was sharp, and my hands, slender and smooth, not the gnarled, calloused things they once were, trembled in disbelief. I was trapped in this woman's form, unable to understand how or why. I tried going back to the antique shop, hoping the old woman could help me, but the alley where it had been was gone. No sign of the shop, no trace of her. It was as if it had never existed. As the days turned to weeks, I realized I was stuck. There was no reversing it. I was no longer the man I had been for 65 years. I was her. And as much as I fought it, as much as I tried to cling to the remnants of who I was, I could feel myself slipping. The thoughts, the memories, they were becoming hers too. At first it was subtle. I would remember something from my past only to question if it had really happened to me, or I'd catch myself thinking in ways that didn't feel like my own. Feminine thoughts, feminine feelings bubbling up from deep within me, as if her soul was trying to merge with mine. And then came the dreams. I dreamed of her life. I dreamed of moments that I knew weren't mine, sitting in a park as a child, laughing with friends, crying over a broken heart. Her emotions were vivid and real. When I woke, I could still feel them lingering, like ghosts haunting the edges of my mind. It wasn't just dreams, though. Memories flooded in at random times, flashes of her life intruding into my own. I began to know things about her. Her name, her favorite color, the smell of the perfume she used to wear. Her name was Marie, and she had lived a life that was now tangled irrevocably with mine. Sometimes in the dead of night, I would stand in front of the mirror, one of the few I hadn't destroyed, and speak to her, trying to reach some part of the woman whose body I now seemed to inhabit. "Marie," I'd whisper, "why me? Why are you here?" But she never answered. The only voice I ever heard was my own. Months passed and I adjusted to my new form as best I could. I wore loose clothing, avoided public places, and let my hair grow long. The body felt foreign and alien, but there was no denying its youth. I was a young woman now, whether I liked it or not. I tried to live a normal life, or as normal as one can under such circumstances. I ventured out only when necessary, always keeping my head down, always avoiding eye contact, but people noticed. Of course they did. How could they not? "Excuse me, miss." Those words, the ones I dreaded most, came one afternoon at the grocery store. I froze, my heart racing as an older man approached me, smiling kindly. "Sorry to bother you, but I think you dropped this." He held out a wallet, my wallet, which had slipped from my purse. I took it from him with trembling hands, muttering a quiet thank you. He nodded and walked away, but the encounter left me shaken. I had been seen. I had been recognized as her, not the man I had been. It wasn't long before I noticed the stares. Men, mostly, their eyes lingering a little too long, their smiles a little too eager. It made my skin crawl. I wasn't used to this attention, this uncomfortable scrutiny. In my old life, I had been invisible, just another old man going about his business. But now I was something else. Something desirable. I avoided people even more after that. I couldn't bear the way they looked at me, the way they treated me. It was too much, too strange. And then came the letters. One evening, I found a note slipped under my front door. No name or return address, just a single word. Marie. My hand shook as I unfolded it. The message was cryptic, but it sent chills down my spine. I know who you are. I couldn't sleep that night. Someone knew. Someone out there understood what had happened to me. Or worse, they thought I was her. But how? Who could possibly know about the curse, about the mirror? Over the next few days, more letters came, each one more unsettling than the last. They were brief, taunting, filled with vague threats and cryptic warnings. Whoever was sending them seemed to know me, or rather, her. They spoke of things only Marie would know. Personal things. Dark things. One letter stood out from the rest. It arrived in an envelope stained with something dark. Blood, maybe? And contained only a single sentence. You can't escape who you are. That night I heard footsteps outside my house. I rushed to the window, peering through the curtains into the darkness. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I bolted the door, my heart pounding. Fear gnawed at me, a sickening dread that I couldn't shake. I knew they were coming for me. Whoever they were, they wanted Marie, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. In a moment of desperation, I smashed the last mirror in the house. Glass shattered across the floor, but it did nothing to break the curse. I was still her, still trapped in this body, this life that wasn't mine. The footsteps came closer. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was going to do. I wasn't a fighter. I had never been one. But as the doorknob rattled and the shadow loomed closer, I knew I had no choice. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the old woman from the shop. But she was different now. Her eyes gleamed with malice, her skin stretched tight over her bones like parchment. You can't run from it, she whispered, stepping inside. You are her now. I backed away, raising the knife, but she only smiled, that same twisted grin she had worn the day I bought the mirror. Don't you see, she said. You've always been her. The mirror didn't change you. It revealed you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the truth was staring me in the face. I hadn't been cursed. I had been shown who I really was. The man I had been was just an illusion, a life lived in denial of my true self. Marie had always been a part of me, buried deep, waiting to be set free. As the old woman approached, I dropped the knife, my body trembling with the weight of the realization. There was no escape. There never had been. I was her. I had always been her. And now there was no going back. The town of Frostmoor had always been an afterthought on the map, a forgotten place where winters were relentless and summers brief. Hemmed in by thick pine forests and snow-covered mountains, Frostmore's isolation bred legends. The most enduring of these legends was of the Eldwyrm, a creature whose name was spoken in the hush of night, with firelight casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. No one really believed in the Eldwyrm anymore, at least not out loud. The story had faded into folklore, something to scare the children when they wandered too far from their parents' sight. It was said that the creature came with the first snow, its presence heralded by strange winds and the crackling of ice in the trees. What it wanted, no one knew, but those who saw it never returned. October settled over Frostmore like a heavy cloak, colder than usual. The frost that clung to the shadows felt unnatural, not the delicate ice lace the townsfolk were used to. People whispered about the early onset of winter, but dismissed the oddity, blaming it on climate change or freak weather patterns. But deep down, in places they didn't speak about, some remembered the legend of the Eldwyrm. For Lucy Merritt, the frost brought a different sort of chill. She was new to Frostmore, having moved there for the quiet after years of chaos in the city. Her neighbors were kind enough, though wary of newcomers. There was something in their eyes, an unspoken knowledge, a secret that only the town shared. She first noticed the strange happenings 3 nights after the frost began. Lucy had been sitting by the fire, a cup of hot tea cradled in her hands, staring out into the snowy wilderness that surrounded her isolated cabin. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of the wind. But then, as the firelight flickered, she thought she saw movement in the trees. Just a flash, a dark, shifting form barely perceptible through the snowfall. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and it was gone. Just the wind stirring the trees, she told herself. But the feeling of unease settled deep into her bones, like a buried ember waiting to ignite. The next day, Lucy ventured into town, her boots crunching over the frozen earth. The streets were emptier than usual, the market square almost devoid of people. The locals who did cross her path were quiet, avoiding eye contact. She overheard snippets of conversation in low voices, words like early frost, something's wrong, and he's coming back. She stepped into the general store, greeted by the warmth of a wood-burning stove. Behind the counter stood an older man, his skin weathered and his eyes sharp despite his years. "You must be Lucy Merritt," he said, his voice gravelly. She smiled, taken aback by his familiarity. "That's me. Word travels fast in small towns, I guess." He did not smile back. "It's a small town, and it's not just word that travels fast here." He paused, studying her. "You seen anything strange up at your place?" Lucy hesitated. "Strange? Like what?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You'd know if he saw it. Something that don't belong. Something cold. If you do, you come tell me. Don't keep it to yourself." The air between them seemed to freeze over. Lucy nodded, unnerved by the intensity in his gaze, and left the store as quickly as she could. That night, the wind howled louder than before, rattling the shutters on Lucy's cabin windows. She tried to sleep, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She tossed and turned in bed, listening to the creaking of the wood and the distant whisper of the wind. But then, just past midnight, a different sound pierced through the cold. A low, mournful howl that didn't sound like any animal she had ever heard. Lucy's heart raced. She sat up in bed, straining her ears to listen. Another howl, this one closer, deeper. It was followed by the distinct crunch of snow, as though something massive was moving through the woods just outside her cabin. With trembling hands, she reached for the flashlight on her nightstand and crept toward the window. She hesitated before peering out, dreading what she might see. There, in the clearing just beyond the tree line, was a shape. Hulking, taller than any man, its form wrapped in shadow. At first glance, it resembled a wolf, but its proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, its back hunched, and its head was massive, crowned with jagged horns that glistened like ice. Its eyes were what made her breath catch in her throat. Two orbs of deep, glowing blue, colder than the frost itself. She couldn't move. Paralyzed by terror as the creature slowly turned its gaze toward her cabin, the beam of her flashlight flickered, the light briefly catching the outline of its body. It was covered in fur, but the fur was mottled with patches of smooth, frozen skin, like frost-bitten flesh. Its breath came in great heaving clouds, misting in the cold air. The creature's mouth opened, and a guttural sound rumbled from deep within its chest, a sound that was almost a voice. Eldwyrm. Lucy stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned off the flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness, hoping, praying, that the creature would not come closer. Outside, the wind picked up again, the howl rising in a crescendo before fading into silence. Over the next week, the cold grew worse. It wasn't just the weather anymore. Something unnatural had settled over Frostmoor. A cold that seemed to seep into the very soul of the town. The locals became more withdrawn, their faces gaunt, their eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Lucy saw less and less of them. People locked their doors early, and the lights in their homes flickered out long before sunset. The strange sightings continued. Each night, Lucy heard the distant howls, and each night the creature seemed to come just a little closer. She stopped sleeping entirely, too terrified to close her eyes, and she wasn't alone. Whispers spread throughout the town that others had seen the creature as well, that it wasn't just a legend anymore. It was real, and it was hunting. Desperate for answers, Lucy returned to the general store and confronted the old man. His name, she had learned, was Caleb, and he had lived in Frostmoor his entire life. "You know something about this," Lucy said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "What is the Eldwyrm?" Caleb's face darkened and For a long moment, he didn't speak. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. It's an old curse, older than the town itself. The Eldwyrm comes when the cold gets too deep, when the land is forgotten and forsaken. It's a guardian, in a way, but not a kind one. Lucy's stomach churned. A guardian of what? Of the land, of the cold. It comes when people forget the balance, when they take too much from the land and give nothing back. The Eldwyrm is the ice, the snow, the winter that never ends. It was here before the town, and it'll be here long after we're gone. But why now? Lucy demanded. What woke it up? Caleb shook his head. That's the question, isn't it? Something's changed. Something's broken the balance. The town of Frostmoor had once thrived on its connection to the land, with logging and hunting providing for the community. But in recent years, corporate interests had moved in, cutting deeper into the forests and draining the natural resources without care. Lucy learned that the local logging company had clear-cut vast swaths of forest just outside the town, leaving the land barren and exposed. She realized then that the Eldwyrm wasn't just a monster, it was a warning. The creature had come back because the town had taken too much, and now the land was fighting back. Lucy tried to convince the townsfolk to do something, to stop the logging, to restore the balance. But her words fell on deaf ears. The fear in their eyes was too deep, and the belief that they could change things had long since been buried beneath the snow. As the frost deepened and the days grew shorter, Lucy knew that her time was running out. The Eldwyrm was coming. It had marked her, just as it had marked the town. She could feel its presence growing stronger each night, could hear its howls echoing through the trees like a death knell. On the final night, the air was deathly still, the cold so intense that the fire in her hearth could barely keep it at bay. Lucy sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. And then she saw it. The Eldwyrm stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form wreathed in frost. This time it didn't linger. It began to move toward the cabin, slow and deliberate, its glowing eyes fixated on her. The ground trembled with each step, and the temperature plummeted with its approach. Lucy's breath fogged in front of her as she backed away from the window, her heart racing. She knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door to her cabin rattled as the creature's claws scraped against the wood. The sound was deafening, like ice splintering under immense pressure. Lucy closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of smashing through the door, the Eldwyrm spoke. Its voice was a low, rumbling whisper, like the wind over a frozen wasteland. You took too much. Lucy's eyes flew open, and she saw the creature standing in the doorway, its form looming over her like a shadow made of ice. It reached out with one massive claw, touching the air just in front of her face, and for a moment she felt nothing but cold. Pure, unrelenting cold that froze her from the inside out. And then, just as quickly, the Eldwyrm withdrew. It turned, disappearing into the night, leaving nothing behind but the frost that crept ever closer. By morning, Lucy was gone. Her cabin stood empty, the door left ajar, the frost creeping over everything inside. The townsfolk searched for her, but all they found were her footprints, leading out into the woods and vanishing in the snow. And so the legend of the Eldwyrm grew. Some said it had taken her, claimed her for breaking the balance like a sacrifice. Others believed she simply left, escaping the town before the cold consumed her. But the cold never left Frostmoor. It lingered, growing stronger each year, and the townsfolk knew, deep down, that the Eldwyrm was still watching, still waiting for the day when the balance would be restored, or the town would finally succumb to the frost. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath my apartment door sometime between midnight and the gray, indifferent hours of early morning. No envelope, no postage, just a single sheet of cream-colored paper folded in thirds, smelling faintly of something I couldn't name. Not quite rain, not quite rot, but something hovering between the two, like the air before a storm decides what it wants to become. Come to the hill at Vassar's Point, Friday. When the wind speaks, listen. I should have thrown it away. I know that now, and the way you know things only after they've already destroyed you, with perfect, useless clarity. I'd been a journalist for 11 years, and in that time I'd covered cults the way other reporters covered city council meetings, dutifully, without much surprise, with the quiet resignation of someone who has long since stopped being shocked by what people will surrender themselves to. I'd written about groups that drank herbal tinctures to commune with dead planets. I'd sat across from a man who believed his lawnmower was a prophet. I'd filed a 1,400-word piece on a commune in rural Vermont where members communicated exclusively through interpretive breathwork. So when my editor Donna called me Thursday morning and said she'd heard rumors about something gathering out at Vassar's Point, a group, she said, a wind group, I told her I already had my invitation. She paused. How? I don't know, I said. And that was the first true thing I'd said in a long time. Vassar's Point is a hill on the eastern edge of the county, bald and broad-shouldered, rising out of flat farmland like something in the earth pushed up in its sleep. There are no trees at the summit. The wind moved over the bald summit the way something ancient might test the surface of newly formed water. Locals say the wind up there is different. Not stronger exactly, but purposeful. The way a river is purposeful, moving with the specific intention of getting somewhere. Old farmers used to say the hill was listening. I'd always assumed that was the kind of poetic nonsense rural people invented to make flat land feel mythological. I arrived at dusk, recorder in my jacket pocket, notebook in my hand, wearing the studied casualness of someone pretending they weren't afraid. There were perhaps 40 people already gathered at the summit, arranged in a loose circle, facing outward. Not inward, as cult gatherings typically orient themselves, but outward, each person facing the horizon as though waiting for something to arrive from every direction simultaneously. They were ordinary looking. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Middle-aged men in fleece jackets, young women with graduate school haircuts, a retired-looking couple holding hands, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck, not wearing them, which struck me as oddly significant, though I couldn't say why. A woman approached me, tall, perhaps 60, with silver hair cut close to her skull and eyes the color of weathered wood. She smiled without showing her teeth. "You came," she said. "I was invited." "Everyone is invited," she said. "Most people just don't hear it." Her name was Marin. She spoke about the wind the way theologians speak about God, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, but as a presence, a consciousness, something ancient and attentive that moved through the world, gathering information, carrying messages, filling the spaces between living things with its own invisible grammar. The group called themselves the Alloy, from the Greek word for a wind instrument, she explained, a flute or a pipe. They believed human beings were hollow, like instruments, and that the wind played through them if they were willing to be emptied. "Emptied of what?" I asked. "Of everything that makes noise," she said. I wrote that down. I wrote everything down. The ceremony, if it could even be called that, began when the last light left the sky. They stood in their outward-facing circle and they simply breathed, slowly, in unison, a rhythm that took perhaps 3 minutes to establish and then lock in with an almost mechanical precision. In, out, in, out. The sound of 40 people breathing together in the dark on a bald hill is something I am not able to adequately describe. It was not peaceful. It wasn't sinister. It was something older than either of those words. Something that made the distinction between them feel irrelevant. I stood slightly outside the circle, observing, and then, I don't know when it happened or how, I was breathing with them. I didn't decide to. My body simply joined. Marin, who had positioned herself near me, leaned close and whispered, "It chooses its instruments." I told myself it was just suggestion. Mass psychology. The kind of respiratory entertainment that happens in crowds, at concerts, in churches. I told myself this with great conviction, standing on a hill in the dark, breathing in perfect synchrony with 39 strangers, while the wind moved through us like a thought moving through a mind. I went back. That's the part I find hardest to explain, even now. I went back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and the one after that. I told Donna I was still gathering material. I told myself the same thing. I filled 3 notebooks with observations, quotes, theological frameworks, the Alloy's cosmology of wind, their belief that every breath ever exhaled by every living creature still existed somewhere in the atmosphere, that the wind was a library, that it remembered everything. I told myself I was working. I was not working. The first death happened on a Wednesday in October, 6 weeks after my initial visit to Vassar's Point. A man named Gerald Foss was found in his car at the edge of Lake Berryessa, and the flat, reedy dark where the water meets the shore and the wind comes off the surface in long, unbroken sheets. The police report described the scene in the clipped, affectless language of official documentation, but my contact at the department, a 20-year veteran named Briggs, called me before the report was even filed, and his voice had the quality of a man who has opened a door he cannot now close. The wounds, he said, the binding, the positioning of the body. I waited. It matches Berryessa, he said. September 1969, the Zodiac attack. Not just the general method, the specific details. Details that were sealed. Details that were never, in 50 years of investigation, released to the public. I sat very still. Outside my window, the wind moved through the street below, lifting a newspaper from a recycling bin, carrying it in a slow, spiraling ascent until it disappeared above the roofline. The Zodiac Killer. Never identified, never caught. A case that had outlasted the detectives who worked it, the journalists who covered it, the cryptographers who spent decades on the ciphers he'd sent to newspapers, ciphers some of which had never been fully decoded. A killer who had simply stopped, or disappeared, or dissolved back into the ordinary population of the world, leaving behind only method and mystery and the long, unresolved silence of an open case. I thought about what Marin had said. The wind is a library. It remembers everything. I should have gone to the police then. I understand that. But I had no evidence, only a pattern that might have been coincidence, a philosophical framework that might have been metaphor, and a growing irrational certainty that felt less like journalistic instinct and more like something I'd inhaled on that hill and couldn't exhale back out. The second death happened 11 days later. A man found on a stretch of beach south of San Francisco, the particular geography of it deliberate. I was certain. A location chosen the way a composer chooses a key. He had been a member of the Alloy. I recognized him from the circle, a quiet man in his 50s who always stood facing west toward the ocean, as though he expected the wind to arrive from across the water. Briggs called me again. This time his voice had lost his professional steadiness entirely. He spoke in the careful, halting way of someone describing something they don't have the vocabulary for. The Doodler, he said. I knew the case. San Francisco, mid-70s. A killer who approached gay men in bars and nightclubs, sketched their portraits on napkins or scraps of paper, then lured them away and murdered them. 14 confirmed victims. 3 survivors who refused for decades to come forward, reportedly because the killer was a prominent public figure and they feared the exposure of their own sexuality in an era when that exposure carried its own violence. The case was never solved. The Doodler was never identified. The signature, Briggs said, the specific signature, the way the... He stopped, collected himself. There was a detail, something the original investigators kept back, something that was in a sealed file I had to get special clearance to access. He paused again. It was there, at the scene, exactly, like someone had read the file. No one read the file, I said. No, he agreed. No one could have. The line was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet I could hear, faintly, the sound of wind moving past his end of the call, a soft, continuous exhalation, like something breathing against the receiver. "Briggs?" I asked. "I'm here," he said, but his voice had changed, flattened, emptied of something. I drove to Marin's house that night. She lived at the base of Vassar's Point in a farmhouse that looked as though it had been standing since before the concept of maintenance was invented. Gray boards, sagging porch, windows that caught the moonlight at angles that made them look like closed eyes. She answered the door before I knocked. She was wearing a white linen shirt despite the cold, and her silver hair was loose, moving slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. "You know," I said. It wasn't a question. "Come in," she said. Inside, the house smelled of that same unnameable scent from the invitation, between rain and rot, between living and not. She made tea I didn't drink and sat across from me at a kitchen table scarred with decades of use, and she explained. The alloy did not worship the wind the way a congregation worships a deity, with petition and praise and the hope of reciprocal favor. They served it. They believed the wind was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a form of consciousness that had existed since the first atmosphere formed around the first cooling rock, that had been present at every moment of human history, that had moved through every room, every field, every dark street corner where every act of violence had ever been committed, and that it had been accumulating. Before there was even air to move, there was the impulse to move. Before the first sky, there was the pressure that would become sky. The wind does not alter the course, she said with hushed adoration. It is the course. They believe that the wind does not destroy things. It merely encourages them to become what they were always going to become. It absorbed it, Marin said. Then she paused. Or perhaps we absorbed it. It's difficult to know which direction influence moves when you're inside the storm. Every method, every ritual, every signature, like the way it absorbs pollen, carries seeds, distributes spores, it carries knowledge the same way. "And the unsolved ones," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. The words arrived the way breathing had arrived on the hill, without my permission. It's specifically choosing the unsolved ones. Marin looked at me with those weathered wood eyes, and something in them shifted. Not surprise, but a kind of satisfaction. The expression of a teacher whose student has finally reached the right answer by the right method. "The solved cases are finished," she said. "Closed. The knowledge was extracted, examined, contained in files and courtrooms in the public record. It was processed. Those it allowed to close." She turned her teacup slowly in her hands. "But the unsolved ones, those methods were never fully known, never fully understood. The wind carried them, and no human mind ever completed the picture. They remain," she paused, "open." "Open," I repeated. "Like an unresolved chord," she said. "Like a question that was never answered. The wind has been holding those methods for decades, centuries in some cases." waiting for instruments capable of expressing them fully. She set the teacup down. Jack the Ripper's Whitechapel, the Axeman of New Orleans, the Zodiac, the Doodler, the Servant Girl Annihilator of Austin, Texas back in 1885. Every killer who was never found, never named, never explained. The wind was there. The wind watched. The wind was there before they arrived. It was there after they left. It was there when the idea first took shape, thin and formless. And it was there when the idea required a body. And the wind remembers what no detective, no file, no sealed record ever fully captured. She smiled then, not at me, but at something just beyond my shoulder, as though she could already hear the end of a piece I hadn't realized had begun. I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You're saying it knows who they were," I said. "It knows what they did," Marin said. "Every detail, every hidden particular, the things the survivors couldn't articulate, the things the victims took with them. The wind was in those rooms and on those streets, and it missed nothing." She looked at me steadily. "And now it's continuing what was never finished, to complete the record, to resolve the chord. And now what was unfinished is moving again." I realized too late that resolution in music does not end a piece, it only makes the next movement possible. "Through your members," I said. "Some of our members," she said carefully, "become very empty, very open. The wind needed to express what it had learned. It needed," she paused, searching for the word, "hands." "Instruments," I said, the word from the first night. "Hollow things the wind plays through." "I'm describing nature," she said, without any particular emotion. "The wind doesn't distinguish between carrying a seed and carrying an idea. It doesn't distinguish between a gentle breeze and a gale. It simply moves, and it revels in what remains unfinished. Completion is a kind of silence. It does not like silence." I left. I drove back to the city with every window in my car sealed shut, the vents closed, the recycled air growing stale and close around me. And I told myself I was being rational, that I was processing a disturbed woman's disturbing confession, that there was a human explanation for everything I'd heard and seen and felt on that hill. I called Donna when I got home. I told her I had the story. I told her it was bigger than we'd thought. She said she'd clear space in the weekend edition. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, and I began to type. The wind found the gap under my front door. I know that sounds like nothing. Doors have gaps. Wind moves through them. This is physics, not horror. But I felt it the moment it entered. A cold thread of air that moved across the floor and climbed my chair leg and reached my ankle with the specific, deliberate intention of something that knew exactly where I was sitting. I kept typing. The air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the barometer. The papers on my desk lifted slightly, not scattered, not blown. Lifted, as though being read. I kept typing. And then I heard it. Not with my ears. With something older than ears. Some receptor in the brainstem. Some ancient biological antenna that predates language and reason and the comforting lie of rational thought. A sound like breathing, like 40 people breathing in perfect synchrony, like a library exhaling. My fingers stopped moving on the keyboard, and the document on my screen, below the last line I had typed, new words appeared, one letter at a time, slowly, with the unhurried patience of something that has existed since before patience even had a name. The words did not feel addressed to me. They felt like something I had already written and forgotten writing. You have been listening. I pushed back from the desk. The chair rolled 2 feet and stopped. The cursor blinked. We have been listening to you. The wind under the door strengthened. The papers rose higher. The temperature dropped further, and in the dropping cold I could smell it again. That smell from the invitation, from Marin's house, from the hill. Between rain and rot, between living and not. The smell of something that had been present on every dark street in Whitechapel, on the shores of Lake Berryessa, in every fog-thick San Francisco night where something terrible and unresolved had happened and then simply stopped, leaving behind only the open wound of an unanswered question. You are very hollow, the screen read. You have been emptying yourself for weeks, writing, observing, removing yourself from the story. That is how instruments are made. Then, after a pause, the cursor blinking with the rhythm of a slow, patient heartbeat, there are still so many open cases. I ran for the door. I grabbed my keys and my phone and I ran, and in the hallway the building's ventilation system breathed against the back of my neck with warm, pressured air. And in that breath I felt something enormous and attentive and ancient take notice of me, the way a musician takes notice of a flute they've just picked up, with interest, with intention, with the specific focus of something about to make a sound. I'm writing this from a motel 2 states away, windows sealed with duct tape, towels pressed against the gap beneath the door. I've turned off the air conditioning. I breathe through a wet cloth when I sleep, which I barely do. Briggs is dead, I found out this morning. The details haven't been released, but a source at the department sent me a single word in a text message before going silent. Zodiac. Not a copycat, not an approximation. The word my source used in a follow-up message sent 40 minutes later and then immediately deleted was identical. As though the case had simply resumed after more than 50 years, exactly where it left off. Donna hasn't answered her phone in 36 hours. I keep thinking about what Marin said. The solved cases are finished, but the unsolved ones remain open. I've been making a list here in this sealed room of every unidentified killer in recorded history. I stopped when I reached 138 and realized I wasn't even close to done. When I looked again, the number was different. Not because I had miscounted, but because something somewhere had just become unresolved. I didn't recount. 138 open chords. 138 unresolved questions the wind has been holding in its lungs for decades, some for centuries, waiting for hollow enough instruments to play them through. I don't know how many members of the alloy are still standing in circles on hills across the country, facing outward, breathing in unison, emptying themselves for something that has been filling itself with the worst of human history since the first wind moved across the first dark water. I don't know how you stop a thing that has no body, how you imprison air, how you silence something that speaks in the spaces between words, and the pause between inhale and exhale, and the hollow of every instrument that has ever made a sound. I know only this. The wind was in Whitechapel in 1888, and it learned something that no detective ever did. It was on the shores of Lake Berryessa in 1969, and it memorized what the files never captured. It moved through the fog-thick streets of San Francisco in the 1970s, and it sketched portraits in its memory that no one ever identified. It has been patient in the way that only something without a lifespan can be patient, not waiting for an opportunity, but simply existing until the opportunity arrived. And now, the opportunities are everywhere, because the alloy are everywhere, because emptiness, it turns out, is not a difficult thing to cultivate in people. Grief does it. Loneliness does it. The particular modern hollowness of feeling unseen and unheard in a world that is louder than it has ever been. That does it faster than anything. The wind doesn't need to recruit. It just needs to wait for people to become quiet enough to hear it. Waiting, I am beginning to understand, is not a passive state for it. It is simply how it exists. I am trying very hard not to be hollow. I am trying very hard to be full of noise. But I can feel the silence growing in me like a held breath, and I know, with that perfect, useless clarity I mentioned at the beginning, that the wind has already found the gaps I didn't know I had. It is already inside. It always was. It is reading this as I write it, or perhaps this is how it reads, by arranging the hand that holds the pen. Perhaps it is the writer. And somewhere in its vast, ancient memory, it is cross-referencing my shape against more than 138 open cases, settling me into the one that I fit best, as though I had been a missing piece long before I was born. It is very, very close to finding it. I think I finally understand what it means to listen.
The above document was recovered from room 14 of the Clearwater Motor Inn, County Route 9, on the morning of November 3rd. The room was found sealed from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry or exit. The author has not been located. Investigating officers noted an unusual smell in the room, described variously as before a storm, like old rain, and like something between alive and not. The windows were intact. The duct tape was undisturbed. The door had been opened from the inside. The list on the bedside notepad had been continued in a different handwriting. It went on for 11 more pages. The final page ended mid-sentence, scrawling off page.